Thank you to MPB for sponsoring this video. This is the Leica SL, and it's a full-frame mirrorless camera that really isn't like any of the mirrorless camera I've ever tested. Why? Well, despite it being originally released almost 10 years ago now in 2015, it has a bunch of interesting and somewhat innovative features that really made this a camera way ahead of its time. And ultimately, that means that even by today's standards, this is still an incredibly competent camera. Now, before we do a full deep dive into all of those features, I do need to confess that despite reviewing countless cameras over the years, whether that's here on YouTube or in my past life when I worked for a photography magazine, in all of that time I have never actually reviewed or even shot with a Leica camera. In fact, until now I've never even handled one, so this was a completely new experience for me.
I'm a virgin!
And I suspect, like many of you watching right now, I have always been curious to find out whether owning a Leica camera really does live up to all of the hype, because as you probably know, owning a camera like this with a fancy red dot on it usually means that you have to shell out a serious amount of money. For example, at launch, this SL had a retail price of around $7,500, which even saying that amount out loud makes me vomit in my mouth a little bit. But obviously, with this camera being a little long in the tooth, these days you can actually buy one for much cheaper than that. In fact, currently on MPB, you can pick one up for between £1,200 and £1,600, depending, of course, on the condition. Or in the US, for one in excellent condition, they're going for around $2,100. Now, just to be clear, I am not saying that $2,100 for a camera is by any means cheap, because there are obviously plenty of other cameras that are way cheaper than this thing. But it is important to remember that we are now in the world of Leica, and in Leica world, $2,100 is widely considered a very low price for a camera. But regardless of whether or not you think this is actually a cheap camera, common sense dictates that you should never buy a camera based on the brand name alone. So is this Leica actually worth buying? Well, I've got to say that when I did first pick this camera up, I was pretty blown away by the build quality. Over the years, I've heard so many people just creaming over the build quality of Leica cameras, but I've always somewhat cynically thought that that was just a bunch of hype created by people who are desperately trying to justify the reason why they bought a camera that costs as much as a car. But I will hold my hands up here and say I was completely wrong. I mean, assuming that every Leica is built to this kind of level, I completely get what all the hype is about. It is actually quite hard to explain without actually physically having this in your hand, but I've never handled a camera that feels quite as solid and complete as this. I mean, sure, some of that is to do with the sheer size of this thing and also the materials that Leica have chosen to build it out of, but it is also a lot to do with how this thing has been so seamlessly put together. I mean, honestly, there isn't a single screw, rivet, or even a seam in sight. I also think that the styling of this camera is just beautiful. I mean, sorry to bring it up again, but this is a 10-year-old camera, and honestly, I think if I didn't know that and somebody just handed me this out of the blue and told me it was Leica's latest release, I would totally believe them. Though despite me just fanboying about the aesthetics of this thing, there are certainly things I don't like about it. The main gripe I have with it is that none of the buttons or dials are actually labelled. Now, although that certainly helps to make this camera look way cleaner and much more modern, when handling this camera for the first time, I just felt completely lost. In fact, this is the first camera that I've ever reviewed where I actually had to take a look at the user manual just to figure out how to actually use it. Normally, with most cameras, I'm able to just pick one up, dive right in, and everything is pretty much self-explanatory because by and large, they all handle in a similar way. But with this, for the first few days at least, I routinely found myself just chimping around and pressing all of the buttons in a feeble attempt to remind myself what they actually do.
Oh no!
Also, there are these 4 main buttons around the screen here on the back that have a secondary function which really isn't immediately obvious. A single press will activate various options according to whatever the corresponding icon alludes to, but if you hold them down for a second, you'll gain access to other settings such as ISO, white balance, and focusing modes. And you know, ISO in particular is a fairly important option that you need to change. So imagine my frustration when I'm picking this up for the first time and I just cannot for the life of me find out how to change ISO. Now, although I do actually think that this dual functionality is pretty damn clever and really useful, it certainly isn't something that's commonplace on most cameras. And so without any kind of labeling on the camera camera itself, or even an on-screen hint to just give you a nudge in the right direction, you're kind of left scratching your head, and that is pretty frustrating as a first-time user. But obviously this is only going to be a short-term problem, and once you have got familiar with this camera and your muscle memory starts to take over, it all feels second nature, and this is actually a very nice camera to shoot with. The hand grip in particular is super large and really comfortable, and with this camera being slightly taller than most other options, there's plenty of space for all four of your digits to grip on tightly, making it particularly well suited for those with larger hands. All of the buttons and dials are super tactile and clicky, and although there isn't a D-pad on the back, you do at least get a joystick for adjusting the active AF point and navigating the on-screen menus. Now, one of the benefits of the camera controls not having any fixed labels on it is that essentially it's just a blank canvas, and most, if not all, of the buttons and switches on this thing can be fully tailored to suit your own handling preferences. Although the large 3-inch display is fixed in place, it is at least touch sensitive, so it can be used to move the active AF point around, as well as swiping through or zooming into your photos, though for some reason you can't actually use it to navigate the settings menu itself. Built into the rubberized hand grip, there is space for 2 SD card slots, and one of which is UHS 2. And on the bottom, this actually has one of the fanciest battery compartments I have ever seen on a mirrorless camera. This little lever here releases the battery, but you'll notice that it doesn't actually fall out until you give it a slight tap, and then it will come out, and obviously that has been put in place to prevent it from accidentally dropping on the floor. You'll also notice that there's no battery hatch on this. The bottom of the battery has actually been designed to sit flush against the base plate, if I can put it in the right way. There we go. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's a rubber seal around this section too, and this is what makes up part of the camera's pretty extensive dust and weather sealing, meaning that you can actually take this camera out in heavy rain and it'll continue to work without any issues. I mean, probably, because I am definitely not brave enough to take this thing out and test it for myself. Plus, that is assuming that you actually have a Leica brand L-mount lens attached and not a third-party one like I've been using. And that's because, to my knowledge, the Leica brand lenses all have the same level of moisture and dust protection, whereas other third-party lenses like this Sigma 35 don't offer quite as much protection from the elements. Anyway, on the top plate there's a small screen that displays core shooting parameters at a glance, and next to that there's a generously sized EVF. In fact, this was the first Leica camera to include an iRes viewfinder, and yes, you did hear me right, they called it iRes, and yes, I'm pretty certain the pun was intentional. Now, this EVF has a 0.8 times magnification and a crispy 4.4 million dot display, which feels absolutely huge and is honestly a joy to use.
That's what she said.
Again, considering its age, this EVF would easily stand toe-to-toe with most modern viewfinders. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is the fact that this uses L-mount glass, which is obviously shared by Sigma, Panasonic, Blackmagic, amongst others. Which is only a good thing because Leica glass can get very expensive, so having cheaper alternatives available does certainly help to make this somewhat more affordable. And a good way to raise some funds to go towards buying some new lenses for your camera is to sell some of your old or unused camera gear using today's sponsor, MPB. Now, if you haven't heard of MPB before, it's the largest global platform to buy, sell, and trade used photo and video gear. In fact, I use MPB regularly, not only to buy in new cameras to review on this channel, but also for selling all of the old equipment that I no longer use. And that's mainly because MPB really do make selling equipment so quick and easy to do. Just head over to mpb.com and click the Start Selling link at the top of the page. Type in the name of the items you want to sell and give an honest indication of the condition they're in. Once you've built your list, just click the Get Instant Quote button at the bottom of the page and you'll receive your free instant quotation. If you're happy with the price that MPB give you, they will collect your items for free direct from your doorstep. And once they've been checked over by their team of experts, the cash will be deposited in your account in just 2 days. Or alternatively, you could always trade up for something from their extensive range of used cameras and equipment, with all of their items included with a free 6-month warranty as standard. As always, you can find all of the relevant links and information in the video description below, and thanks once again to MPB for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. But anyway, what kind of hardware does this camera have hiding inside? Well, at its core, there's a full-frame 24 megapixel CMOS sensor, which has also had the anti-aliasing filter removed, so as you'll see a little bit later on in this video, this chip is able of capturing some pretty crispy looking photos. It's also no slouch either and can rattle off images up to 11 frames per second, which for its time was pretty groundbreaking. Though I must admit this does come with a few caveats. Firstly, while shooting at 11 frames per second, the autofocus has to be temporarily disabled, so this will of course limit its usage. Also, if you're planning on capturing RAWs at this speed, then you will hit the buffer after around 30 shots or so, which in of itself isn't terrible, but you will then have to sit and wait for about a minute or two as the images write to the SD card. Switching over to JPEG will increase this buffer to over 100 images, and if you do need to maintain full autofocus while shooting, you can reduce the drive mode speed to the medium setting of 7 frames per second, and this will allow you to do that. But being completely honest, the continuous autofocus isn't the greatest anyway, and it does tend to hunt a fair bit when attempting to track a moving target. The good news though is that if you switch over to single focus mode, the AF system is actually very quick and reliable, so I found myself sticking to this for most of the time. There's also a very capable mechanical shutter in this camera that will allow you to shoot up to 1/8,000th of a second, and this max speed can be further extended to 1/16,000th of a second if you are willing to switch over to the electronic shutter. Now, I was quite surprised to find out that this SL has some fairly respectable video options too, and switching over to the video capture mode is as easy as pressing this single button on the top, which is definitely very satisfying. In terms of output options, you can capture 4K 420 8-bit video internally up to 30 frames per second, but this is with a Super 35 crop applied. Or if you want to utilize the full sensor, then you can use the full-sized HDMI output on the side of the camera to record to an external device, allowing up to 4K capture at 422 10-bit. Though I think the biggest drawback that may put videographers off using this camera is that there is no IBIS, and with this being a pretty large and heavy camera, getting steady footage is only really going to be possible with the aid of a gimbal. But let's face it, if you do happen to shoot a lot of video, there are definitely way better options out there at this price range, particularly considering that the autofocus on this is also pretty ropey whilst capturing video. So most likely you will need to entirely rely on manual focus. But what about image quality in terms of stills photography? Is this camera really capable of producing images that are that much better than other full frame options? Well, as you would expect for a camera of this price range, the image quality is certainly very impressive, but whether or not it's far superior to every other camera out there, well, I'll let you guys fight that one out in the comments section. One thing I will say though is I really like the colors that are produced by this camera. It is quite hard to put my finger on exactly what I like, but it just feels like the images just look a little bit more punchy and vibrant. Plus, the flexibility of these raw files is also pretty impressive, particularly when pulling back details from the shadows and highlights, which made working with them an absolute breeze. Now, another thing I like about the raw files is that they are captured in a DNG format, which is universally compatible with just about every piece of editing software out there. That also means you can edit them on your phone, and using the Leica app, you can actually transfer the files directly from this camera to your phone, which is pretty useful if you regularly post your images online. Now, for the purposes of testing this camera out, as I mentioned earlier, Sigma UK were kind enough to loan me an L-mount copy of their 35mm f2 I-series lens, which when mounted to the front of this camera just looks great. It's also a reasonably small and lightweight option too, and as this is already a fairly hefty camera, opting for a smaller lens like this is definitely the way to go. But anyway, the question that I keep asking myself is, would I actually recommend that you spend so much money on a camera like this? And after much thought and deliberation, I think the answer to that is a resounding maybe. Even with its initial handling frustrations, overall I am very, very impressed with this camera, and I like it way more than I thought I would. But whichever way you slice it, £2,000 is still a lot of money to lay down on a 10-year-old camera. So whether you should buy this or not, I guess all boils down to what you prioritize as a photographer. Now, if you're after a camera that offers the best bang for your buck, this is not that, because there are countless other options out there that are way cheaper and will still offer top quality results. However, if you want a camera that prioritizes style, design, and build quality, but is also able to hold its own in terms of performance, then honestly, this would be at the very top of my recommendation list. You could say, I like this camera a lot. You get it, because of Leica. I'll go. Sorry.
Stop it. Get some help.